From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Monday, June 30, 2025. A verdict is looming in the triple murder mushroom trial, with a jury to be sequestered to begin considering their decision on Erin Patterson's charges over a fatal 2023 beef Wellington lunch. Patterson is pleading not guilty. Here at theaustralian.com.au, our subscribers will be the first to find out the verdict and will be able to read all our reporting and analysis. Watch it. That's the unequivocal message from the Chinese ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, who's written an opinion piece for The Australian today, strongly objecting to the idea that Australia and other American allies should increase defence spending. That's after Donald Trump emerged from NATO talks with European allies, pledging to dramatically increase their defence spends. Today, why China is warning Anthony Albanese and how he will respond. China's man in Canberra is Xiao Qian, a 61-year-old senior diplomat, one of the Chinese Communist Party's most trusted.
No country is perfect.
Here's Ambassador Xiao talking to the National Press Club late in 2024 with some frank feedback for Australian media outlets like us.
However, a coverage on a country that is always in a negative perspective is nowhere near to telling the truth. Here in this country, the media coverage on China are mostly not positive.
And a frank warning about the issue that burns brightest for China, the island it regards as a rogue province, Taiwan.
Taiwan is not an independent state.
That is, mind your own business. He said China would never compromise on Taiwan.
Just like no Australian government would ever compromise on Australia's territorial integrity. And just like, maybe it's not a good example, but Tasmania will be a part of Australia.
Now, the ambassador is stepping back into public discourse with another warning for Australia. Don't fall in behind Donald Trump. Xiao has written an opinion piece for The Australian published today. We've used an AI voice to read his words.
China and Australia are friends, not foes. This should never have been in question.
Sounds ominous? It's meant to.
Well, the piece seems to me to be a shot across the bow of the Albanese government.
Jeff Chambers is The Australian's chief political correspondent.
There's a lot of coded language in there, and to me, it's sort of like Ambassador Xiao is making a tactical intervention to put forward China's view of the world. But as usual with Beijing's messaging, it's full of propaganda and untruths.
The ambassador says some countries, that is America, have been hyping up a narrative that China is a threat.
Such rhetoric and actions are steeped in Cold War mentality, blatantly creating division, fueling a global arms race, as well as threatening world peace and stability, which warrants our high vigilance.
China's rage is directed at NATO, the North American Treaty Alliance, which is the US, Canada, the UK and Europe. And China's especially furious with NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte. Remember, he's the one who had this strange interjection when Donald Trump was talking about Israel and Iran.
They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language to
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while you have to use a certain word.
Rutte has made a series of statements that have truly enraged China, like this June 10 speech in London.
Russia has teamed up with China, North Korea and Iran. They are expanding their militaries and their capabilities. They are preparing for long-term confrontation.
Facing these smears and containment, China's economy has demonstrated remarkable resilience, and the living standards of the Chinese people have continued to rise.
There isn't a direct threat in this op-ed, is there, Jeff?
No, there often isn't. Chinese officials speak in their parable-like language, and you will read the piece and you will know that all of the fiercest attacks are directed at the USA. They don't explicitly call out the US, but it's clearly all about Donald Trump and the US and what they're doing, whether it be NATO or closer to home here in the Indo-Pacific. And when you look at the language in this piece, he talks about containment, and that goes to Beijing's paranoia about pacts that we have, things like the Quad security dialogue and also the AUKUS nuclear submarine pact. So you're always looking for certain types of languages, and once you see, for example, the word containment, you know that that is some of the joint exercises or those alliances that we have with our long-standing allies.
There's a lot to unpack in Xiao Qian's op-ed. Let's start with the way the ambassador frames Chinese history.
China has always been a steadfast supporter, defender, and promoter of world peace.
Well, the People's Republic of China does talk a lot about peace, like the way China says it's hoping for the peaceful reunification of China and Taiwan. Taiwan says that would be an invasion. Or the peaceful liberation of Tibet in 1951, which the Tibetans and the United Nations regarded as an invasion.
Over the past 70-plus years, China has never initiated a war or occupied an inch of a foreign land. It is the only country that has incorporated peaceful development in its constitution, and the only country among the nuclear weapon states to pledge no first use of nuclear weapons.
Other nuclear states, like the US and UK, say their nuclear weapons are not designed for a first strike, but are supposed to be a deterrent to potential enemies. China says it's never started a war or occupied anyone else. But China has been involved in numerous armed conflicts with its neighbours, like the Korean War, when China sent forces to fight with the North Koreans, or 1979, when China began a series of skirmishes with Vietnam.
China unwaveringly adheres to a defensive national defense policy, with military spending accounting for just 1.5% of its GDP.
What China says officially is that it spends about 375 billion Australian dollars per annum on defence, rising more than 7% per annum over the past 2 years. The US Defence Department says it believes China is spending vastly more than it admits.
It is far below the global average and paling in comparison to certain hegemons or their allies and partners.
That's true. The US spends approximately 1.5 trillion Australian dollars a year on defence. In percentage of GDP terms, China is vastly outspent by countries like Russia, Ukraine, Israel and the UK, although their economies are much smaller than China's, so the total figure is lower.
We know that history tells a different story, both modern and older history, whether it's taking control of Xinjiang, the military occupation of Tibet, and the invasion or attempted invasion of North Vietnam. So you've got to really cut through the spin of these senior Chinese officials.
Coming up, so do we risk further aggravating China if we do what Donald Trump wants? So now the United States has made its position very clear. It wants Australia to dramatically increase defence spending. China is now also making its position very clear that it doesn't want Australia to do that. Anthony Albanese wants a meeting with Donald Trump. So how do Albanese and Penny Wong play it from here?
Look, it's really high-stakes diplomacy right now, and I was just overseas for the G7 summit in Canada, and a lot of hopes were pinged around that meeting between Anthony Albanese and Donald Trump on day 2. Obviously, the US president had to cut short his visit because of what was happening with Iran, but that was a blow, and Anthony Albanese then really bizarrely sort of suggested he might then duck over to the NATO summit at The Hague in the Netherlands to try and catch Donald Trump there, and pretty quickly came to the conclusion that's probably not a good look or a good idea. So there's furious back-channeling going on. There was talk that Anthony Albanese would head back to the US in September for the UN Leaders Summit, and that they might be able to have a catch-up there at the White House like our other allies have done. But yeah, there's a lot hanging on it, and I thought it was interesting in Ambassador Xiao's piece And it felt like he was sort of talking to the Labor government here and warning about the economic hit for countries if they were to increase their defence spending.
We rely on the same trade routes, and no country, especially a major trading nation like China, has a greater stake in safeguarding maritime security. Differences can be addressed through dialogue, but they should never undermine our friendship.
Australia's in this weird position, aren't we, Jeff, of being simultaneously kind of irrelevant in world politics. You know, we're not part of NATO, and yet it feels very high stakes for us. We're getting big demands from global superpowers who are paying close attention to what we do. Is it possible for Anthony Albanese to do nothing, to keep defence spending where it is, around 2%, and just kind of sail through here, or not?
I think they have to dramatically increase the amount that we spend on defence. And while there has been a lot of focus on the Middle East and Ukraine, the situation here in the Indo-Pacific is where everyone fears the main game is. And a lot of people talked about this at the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, where Pete Hegseth, the US Defence Secretary, met with Richard Marles and directly asked him or urged him to increase Australia's defence spending to 3.5% as soon as possible. And in his speech, Hegseth said it was clear that Beijing, which had made huge investments in nuclear weapons, hypersonics, amphibious assault capabilities, was preparing to potentially use military force. We had those 3 warships that circumnavigated Australia, conducted provocative live-fire exercises in the Tasman Sea. You had the spy ship off the Australian coast around the same time. Then you've got these multiple incidents of the PLA putting our ADF personnel at risk. We are constantly conducting joint exercises in the South China Sea with our partners in Japan, the US, the Philippines and others. So there's a lot going on under the surface. My understanding is that, they are specifically looking at funding programs. I don't know what they are at this point, but I suspect that he's going to have to do something of substance that's in addition to, say, accessing Australia's critical minerals to actually really lock in that alliance. And we do so much together. We've got Exercise Talisman Sabre coming up in the next few weeks, hosted jointly by Australia and the US. Here in Australia, and for the first time in Papua New Guinea, about 19 countries, about 35,000 personnel. It's going to be a huge show of force. China won't be happy about it, but super critically important. And I think that's the disconnect we don't always see publicly. We hear the politicians talking about it, but at a defence and national security level, that cooperation is probably stronger than it ever has been before, outside of World War II.
Jeff Chambers is the Australian's chief political correspondent. Every day there's a giant new global yarn, and the Australian subscribers wake up to the very latest from around the world, plus analysis that makes it all make sense. Join us at theaustralian.com.au.